Welcome to 1189, an online Bible commentary where we walk through every chapter of the Bible. My name is Tyler Marston, and today we're taking a look at Acts 18. Paul is wrapping up his second missionary journey, making disciples in the city of Corinth. Many people with authority hear the gospel and some believe, but most importantly, the disciples Paul is making start making their own disciples, which allows the gospel to spread all over the world and all through time, ultimately to us today. We are the inheritors of this Great Commission, and we have been commanded to make disciples as well. And at the center of it all is the Spirit of Jesus, who unites all believers into one body. Serving Him is how we build for His kingdom now. But before we begin, I just want to remind you that this channel serves as a free resource for you, a video on every chapter of the Bible, all 1,189 of them. So if you want to join us as we look at what the Bible actually says, then subscribe to the channel, like this video if you enjoyed it, and leave a comment or a question below if you have one. After these things, he left Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, having recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome. He came to them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they were working. For by trade they were tent makers. And he was reasoning in the synagogue every Sabbath, and trying to persuade Jews and Greeks. Paul heads west from Athens into Corinth, a major port city in the south of modern-day Greece. Now, just like Lydia in chapter 16 and Jason in 17, Paul stays with locals who are new converts to the way of Jesus. In Corinth, it's a Jewish couple named Aquila and Priscilla. They've been exiled from Rome according to an edict by the Emperor Claudius. And the contemporary historian Suetonius actually corroborates this edict. Now, it's very convenient for Paul because he and Aquila and Priscilla all share the same occupation. They make tents. This meant that Paul could sustain himself off his own income while continuing to share the gospel in these new cities. Paul is very clear about this through Acts and through many of his letters, that he used his own funds to support his ministry. And he continues that ministry here in Corinth as before, preaching Jesus as the Messiah in the local synagogues while also sharing the good news with the Greeks. But when Silas and Timothy came down from Macedonia, Paul began devoting himself completely to the word, solemnly testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. But when they resisted and blasphemed, he shook out his garments and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads. I am clean. From now on, I will go to the Gentiles." Silas and Timothy finally meet up again with Paul in Corinth. Remember, they've been in Berea since the last chapter. Now, at this point, Paul can again turn to full-time ministry. He now has the assistance of Silas and Timothy and the resources that they all brought for their journey. When Paul shares the gospel, he is again met with resistance, as he's seen in other cities. But that doesn't stop him. Instead of preaching in the synagogues, he's sharing the gospels to the Gentiles in Corinth. Paul condemns the blasphemers there, saying that they will have to bear the punishment of their own unbelief. But you kind of get this sense that Paul is really fed up with the city, which is why God sends him some encouragement next. Then he left there and went to the house of a man named Titus Justus, a worshiper of God, whose house was next to the synagogue. Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, believed in the Lord with all his household, and many of the Corinthians, when they heard, were believing and being baptized. And the Lord said to Paul in the night by a vision, "Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking, and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you. For I have many people in this city." And he settled there 1 year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So first, there's a man, probably a Gentile, named Titus Justus, who believes in Jesus, and he opens up his house for Paul and his companions. And it's perfect real estate, because it's right across the street from the synagogue Paul has been having so much trouble with. And it's through that connection that Paul is able to witness to Crispus, the leader of the synagogue, who finally believes in Jesus and is baptized with his whole household. That breaks the wall of the obstinacy, and suddenly Corinthians all over the place are getting baptized into the church. Jesus has provided friends for Paul in this city that looked like it would totally reject the gospel. And Jesus gives Paul a vision, encouraging him not to fear and to keep spreading the gospel in that city. So Paul stays for a year and a half, discipling the believers there and establishing a church. But when Gallio was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews with one accord rose up against Paul and brought him before the judgment seat, saying, "This man persuades men to worship God contrary to the law." But when Paul was about to open his mouth, Gallio said to the Jews, "If it were a matter of a wrong or of a vicious crime, O Jews, it would be reasonable for me to put up with you. But if there are questions about words and names and your own law, look after it yourselves. I am unwilling to be a judge of these matters." And he drove them away from the judgment seat. Just like in Philippi back in Acts 16, the mob continues to persecute the Christians and brings them before the Roman authorities. In Corinth, it's the proconsul named Gallio, who, fun fact, is actually the brother of Seneca. Now remember that the proconsul is like the governor of the region. And remember, back in Cyprus, the proconsul believed in Jesus when Paul and Barnabas shared the gospel with him. Now Gallio is not as open to the gospel, but he does make one major decree. He shuts down the squabbling from the Judeans, ruling that any difference between them and the Christians is a theological one, and not worthy of any legal punishment. As N.T. Wright points out, this is a huge victory for the Christians. That's because Jews had a religious exemption from the imperial cult. They were not required to worship Caesar as everyone else in the empire was. And so under Gallio's ruling, there's now legal precedent that the Christians were seen as a splinter sect of the Jewish people. That gave all Christians this religious exemption as well, whether they were ethnically Jewish or whether they were Gentiles. Now Gallio refuses to hear out the mob, but that doesn't mean he's very sympathetic to the plight of the Christians. And they all took hold of Sosthenes, the leader of the synagogue, and began beating him in front of the judgment seat. But Gallio was not concerned about any of these things. Sosthenes is another synagogue leader who has converted to Christianity, apparently succeeding Crispus during that 18-month gap. He's beaten by an angry mob of Judeans, likely his own congregants. And of course, Gallio doesn't step in to do anything about it. I think this is a good reminder that sometimes even the people closest to us can hinder us from doing God's will, whether that's through explicit persecution, as it is here, or whether it's through gossip, slander, manipulation, or any of Satan's other tactics to bring disunity. Regardless, though, we see that Sosthenes will actually become a part of Paul's crew. The letter of 1 Corinthians was co-written by Sosthenes to his former hometown church. Paul, having remained many days longer, took leave of the brethren and put out to sea for Syria, and with him were Priscilla and Aquila. In Cenchrea, he had his hair cut, for he was keeping a vow. We get a mention of Paul cutting his hair during a brief stint in Cenchrea. Now this was some sort of Nazirite vow, which originated from Numbers chapter 6. These were marked by growing your hair out for the length of the vow, and then cutting it and sacrificing it upon completion. You could really make this kind of vow about anything for any length of time. It might have been abstaining from alcohol or from sex, and it might have been for a few weeks or for a lifetime. But the point is, Paul is still abiding by the traditions of the Hebrew law, not because he has to for his salvation, but because it will allow his Jewish brothers and sisters to take his gospel message more seriously, so that hopefully they will believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They came to Ephesus, and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent, but taking leave of them and saying, "I will return to you again if God wills," he set sail from Ephesus. When he had landed in Caesarea, he went up and greeted the church and went down to Antioch. And having spent some time there, he left and passed successfully through the Galatian region and Phrygia, strengthening all the disciples. Paul wraps up his second missionary journey with a stop in Ephesus and Caesarea before eventually returning home to Antioch. Now the Ephesians are desperate for Paul to stay, but he insists he's got to get back. It's been a long expedition after all, and Ephesus is in the Roman province of Asia, which is where Paul was forbidden to go earlier in the journey. The important part is, though, he leaves implementing Priscilla and Aquila in Ephesus, allowing them to begin to do ministry in that city. And then he promises that he will return if it's in God's will, valuing God's plan much more than his own plan or even his own desires. Now, we've read enough to know that Paul never stays in one place for very long. He eventually leaves for Galatia, which starts his third missionary journey. But first, we get one more quick aside about the ministry in Ephesus. Now, a Jew named Apollos, an Alexandrian by birth, an eloquent man, came to Ephesus, and he was mighty in the Scriptures. This man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in spirit, he was speaking and teaching accurately the things concerning Jesus, being acquainted only with the baptism of John. And he began to speak out boldly in the synagogue. But when Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And when he wanted to go across to Achaia, the brethren encouraged him, and wrote to the disciples to welcome him. And when he had arrived, he greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he powerfully refuted the Jews in public, demonstrating by the Scriptures that Jesus was the Christ. Priscilla and Aquila have gotten busy making disciples of Jesus in Ephesus, one being a very spirited evangelist and teacher named Apollos. He was a Jew who was born in Alexandria and had since moved to Ephesus. And while he had had some knowledge of Jesus through the ministry of John the Baptist, it wasn't exactly the whole story. When Aquila and Priscilla begin to hear him speak, they take him aside and begin to invest in his life. They teach him and help him to understand the full gospel of Jesus, not just his baptism, but about his teachings and his life and his death and his resurrection. And they do this so that Apollos can go back out and preach the gospel in spirit and in truth. Apollos goes on to become a really influential teacher in the region. He's sent to disciple the churches in Achaia, which is where Corinth is. And he even ends up rivaling Paul and Peter in terms of notoriety, all while, of course, being united with them in spirit and in message. And so we see that Paul, doing the work of sharing the good news, has paid back dividends. Because it's not Paul's ministry that's spreading, it's the ministry of Jesus. It's his gospel message. And the disciples Paul has made have made disciples of their own. And the good news of Jesus and his resurrection is being spread to places that were previously inaccessible. That's a mission that we are still called to finish today. Synagogue leaders are believing in Jesus. Roman proconsuls are hearing the gospel. And while it brings persecution, it also brings churches and new faith families. They're all depending on each other in the Spirit of Jesus in order to help their communities and build for the kingdom of God. That should be our goal even today. So, is it? Thanks for watching 1189. We'll see you next time.